Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is a screencast-o-matic presentation on African culture. Before we get started, please let me encourage you to open up to the correct part of today's lesson and scroll down to the correct section. And please be advised that you will have to fill in the key content that appears for the guided notes section. Please also be advised that you might have to answer key concept questions along the way or at the end of the presentation. And also, please know that you can replay any part of this presentation that you might need for detail or clarity. Before we begin, let me preface this. Africa's culture is unique and diverse, but understanding some of the main themes that might combine to form our understanding of traditional African indigenous cultures might give us better foresight in understanding this continent for what it is, eclectic and diverse. So let's get started. African culture. The population of Africa is just enormous. By a recent 2013 estimate, there's approximately 1.033 billion people in the entire continent. And of course, that number is growing. It's expected to double by the year 2050. Not only is Africa growing rapidly as a whole, but the resources influence where people live and really how they live too. It is true that Africa is home to many unique and diverse natural resources. So it only makes sense that with growing numbers of populations, more eyes will be eyeing up the continent as a whole to see what Africa can deliver as well. But in regards to African culture, Africa is home to an immense variety of cultures. There's just so many people and therefore so many different types of stories of different types of people that combine to form our consensus idea of what culture is. But these people not only have different histories, they have different religions, different beliefs and value systems, and also traditions. So when you take a step back and look at Africa objectively, you can better understand for what this unique continent is, just that, unique. Let's first talk about a key point for any culture, family ties. So family loyalty is a bond that has traditionally held these farming and herding societies together. It should be noted that most African traditional indigenous cultures are still in fact key on farming and herding. Extended families are also really important to traditional native indigenous Africans as well. In fact, they're very common in tribal Africa, where grandparents, parents, married and unmarried children, their spouses, and other relatives are all living together and pooling their labor. This is a unique concept because I think most of us, by contrast, have this American construct of what a family is by having, a mom and a dad and maybe two siblings. But in this way, you can begin to see a differentiation upon how people in Africa look at the family as a whole. There are an expansive system of lineages in Africa too, distant relatives within a village and or clans, which is several lineages. And this varies across Africa, of course, but there are complex organizations that show us and tell us how communities work together to essentially stabilize a whole village. Kinship is also really important in Africa. Kinship ties encourage a strong sense of community and cooperation. So please understand what I mean when I say that kinship, lineages, and clans all together provide us insights on the different tiers, if you will, of relationships that exist in African societies. Now, in the issue of how Africans or traditional indigenous Africans do in fact live, most are farming and herding tribes, and they are in fact subsistence farmers. For those of you guys who may not know what that definition is, subsistence farmers are whereby these farmers produce just enough crops for their own needs with little or no surplus. So surplus farmers are for people, of course, who might raise or grow enough crops for, say, a whole society or civilization. But in your traditional native indigenous African tribe, not so much, okay? They are more subsistence farmers. To further prove that point, among many tribes, of course, cattle is really important, probably the most important animal. Cattle equals wealth, simply put. It also could equal high status in their community and also in other social strata as well. Cattle could provide tribes with everything that they needed for survival, including food, obviously, right? But also shelter and clothing too. In fact, cattle as a whole is just really so important for the native traditional indigenous African culture, insofar as much to say that it not only provided them a sense of life, but also a sense of defining their culture too. We could also look at inheritance and descent as being really important to understanding African culture as well. A variety of traditions do in fact govern the inheritance and descent in African societies. Let me explain. So some cultures in Africa are matrilineal, which just means that members trace their lineage through the female line. An example of this might be best proved by the Ashanti people. The Ashanti people believe a child's blood comes from the mother. Therefore, the mother's brother or the uncle has a closer blood relationship to the child than does the father. And so the child inherits property through the uncle then. Obviously, if you're a little bit confused, this is totally different than what we believe to be our westernized view of family and inheritance, right? You might be thinking that we as a culture and society value wills, which allot land and property and possessions to people. But in this way, of course, they view the ties and I guess you could say the bloodlines of families differently. But there are also societies, once again, that are patrilineal. And in other African societies that are patrilineal, they believe that lineage is passed through the male line. So therefore, property and responsibilities are passed to the eldest son exclusively to give them, once again, their share status and signs of wealth. In Africa as well, just as most of us in high school are coming of age, they believe in rites of passage and coming of age too. The age grade system is used in many African cultures to teach children the value of their society and the essence of growing up. In fact, it is steeped in tradition and consists of special ceremonies that mark each step to adulthood. Kind of think of like initiation rituals. So this may not be the most, I guess you could say, relatable example, but it works. Most American adolescents do value getting a permit and then, of course, a driver's license at the age of 16. But of course, with great power, once again, comes great responsibility, right? But a native traditional indigenous African might, of course, have different types of values and rites of passage that are just as important to them. So an age grade is made up of young people in the same age group in a village who might come of age together or at different times, and once again, do so through different ceremonies. Let's take a moment to talk about African religions. Religious beliefs and practices reflect the great variety of cultures in Africa. For example, there are many traditional beliefs, of course. They frequently vary from tribe to tribe, though, and they're passed on typically by oral tradition, so spoken word. And sometimes this could take the form of, like I said, dancing, singing, playing, music, once again, is often very common. In these types of systems, people pray for good health, steady rain for crop cultivation, and maybe a rich harvest as well. But some further examples of this might also include ancestral worship. Native traditional indigenous Africans are key on ancestral worship, also believing that every object on earth is filled with a living spirit, or maybe animism. They also believe that the supreme being in their pantheon or mythology created all things. Once again, this varies across cultures. And they also believe in diviners and healers, sometimes known as shaman, and these people determined causes of misfortune and used roots and herbs to cure ailments, including the common cold. But we can't have a conversation about African religion without the two big ones, Christianity and Judaism and Islam. So Christianity and Judaism together spread down the Nile to Ethiopia around 400 AD. Christian missionaries in the 1800s, during imperialism, when Europe basically took over Africa, set out to replace traditional African religions. In fact, the most famous missionary was David Livingstone. And with varying degrees of success, most Africans did in fact convert. Some, of course, did not. But in many cases, African Christians formed their own churches with their own unique forms of Christianity, with their own practices as well to worship their God accordingly. An example of this might be found and proved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which is still one of the largest denominations of Christianity in Africa today. But Islam, however, is just as important. Islam is the dominant culture of North Africa when we talk about countries like Morocco, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Sudan, and Somalia. And Islam came to Africa by the way of Muslim traders from the Middle East. Later on, we're going to learn more about Mansa Musa and the gold and salt trade that took place across northern Africa, which brought Islam into the forefront of religious focus for many Africans. Here's the last section of our presentation. Of course, when it comes to understanding the culture of Africa, we cannot have a conversation about the continent without talking about slavery. Now, because much of early African history was translated orally and not written, very little is known until the Europeans arrived during the age of imperialism. This is an age where most of the countries who are part of the Western world took over other countries for their own economic need, and some would say greed. So what is known as likely been influenced greatly by those same Europeans. The slave trade, of course, was initiated by Portuguese. So the first contact between Africans and Europeans took place in the 1400s by the following Portuguese explorers that you might be familiar with from previous classes. Now, when we think about the Middle Passage here of the mass exodus of slaves to and through the, quote, New World, obviously these European explorers did in fact uproot them and in many ways impacted their culture. So as Europeans settled the New World, Americas and the Caribbean, right, the demand for slaves grew as Europeans required a large labor force to make agriculture in these colonies profitable. You see, for example, the American slave system as an institution needed human labor. And so, of course, slaves in this way provided us that human labor to provide us with amazing surpluses of crop cultivation for many years, putting America on the economic map, so to speak. But the result of this, of course, is inhuman bondage. The slave trade developed in the 1500s off the coast of West Africa, where the Portuguese left their mark. Of course, near present day, countries like Ghana, Benin, Nigeria, Cameroon, and Gabon would have far reaching consequences, more so than probably what they could have known at the time. These devastating effects on the African continent as a whole result in the loss of both, of course, the oral histories of African people, but also the traditional culture too as we know it. So, in many ways, slavery has in fact altered the course of human events and culture in Africa, insofar as much to say that we don't know for sure exactly how the natural course of human progression would have been had it not been for European imperialism and American imperialism and the slave system as an institution. Although slavery is still heavily debated and talked about today, right? The fact is that we can learn a great deal about African culture when we take an objective look at all the different domains of culture and look at it more holistically and objectively. Thank you very much for tuning in, and good luck with the rest of the lesson.